Here with Weather Echo. How's everyone doing? Wanted to give you an outlook for this weekend and next week. So you've probably been enjoying the cooler, somewhat breezier, and occasional cloudy weather. Well, much warmer conditions and then tropical moisture is in store for next week into next weekend. So let's take a look at a few things. Okay, what's the weather pattern that's going to change? So we're going to lose this big storm system across the west coast. Yes, it's big, but it had very little moisture, though it did bring rain to northern California. Now, what we're going to see is another weather system go by to our north. This one's going to be weaker. It's going to go across the northern Rockies and Montana as shown here. Behind that, a little bit of offshore flow. Yes, offshore flow for Northern California. So that's going to be wind blowing from the land to the water. Not strong, but enough for a significant warm up. And that warm up is going to occur all over California because an upper level ridge of high pressure is going to move over top of it. So we'll be on the back side of this weather system. It's going to move through this weekend, so we'll have breezy onshore flow across most of California. Then we're going to see that weak offshore flow develop Sunday night and Monday. So then we'll see the upper level ridge develop Tuesday and Wednesday. So that'll be the weather pattern coming up and lead to the significant warming trend. Okay, after that, things get a little more interesting if you like tropical moisture. So, a lot like the pattern we had a week ago that brought rain to Northern California and brought also all the thunderstorms to southern and central and as well as parts of Northern California. Another weather system is going to come in off the Pacific. This one's not going to be as strong and it's going to break apart. So part of it's going to leave energy in the East Pacific. We call that a cutoff upper low. So it's going to cut off from the main jet stream that you see shown there. The low pressure area in the upper part of the atmosphere is going to settle off the west coast, somewhere between San Francisco and LA. Now, that upper level ridge of high pressure over Mexico and the Baja that led to our warming trend before this, the difference between the two creates that southerly flow, just like we saw a week ago. That's going to start drawing moisture northward from Southern California into Central California and across much of the Great Basin and the desert Southwest. I call this a pseudo monsoon flow because it can occur all different times of the year, not just during the typical monsoon. Now, this time of year, we can still get monsoon in September and the moisture is close by. So when you get this type of weather pattern, the moisture can transport, like we saw last week, quickly from south to north. So we expect that tropical moisture to follow that black line late next week, as early as Thursday night and Friday next week and into next weekend. Okay, this is a depiction of the moisture. So initially, as we go through the week, even though it's going to be warm, much warmer with a little bit of offshore flow in Northern California, it's going to be dry. So that's a critical fire weather situation. Dry air in place, a little bit of offshore flow, warm, much warmer temperatures, warming above normal. Then late in the week, by Thursday and Friday, we see that moisture start to come up from the south. And again, that's going to be transported from south to north because of the weather pattern, that weak cutoff low in the upper part of the atmosphere, and the upper ridge or heat dome over Mexico. Now, when we get to late in the week, Friday and Saturday, that's when we see the most significant push. Green means more moisture than even normal levels, so it's an anomaly. It does very well showing that this moisture will be significant in Southern California, maybe even the central, Great Basin area, and the Southwest. So this will be a potential pseudo-monsoon to produce scattered showers and thunderstorms across a lot of the Southwest. Now, I have an arrow pointing to tropical moisture. So there is a tropical cyclone in the East Pacific that's expected to develop. Some of that moisture could get torn off and move into that southerly flow and into the Southwest. So all things have to be lined up for that to happen, but it is possible. So we'll watch that as the week progresses. Okay, how have we been doing this summer? Well, it seems like we've been having showers and thunderstorms, and yes, we have, but the monsoon overall was very weak, very minimal. So the west has been dry from the Pacific Northwest through the Great Basin and the Southwest. Now we do have pockets of wetter, and those have been the result of those pseudo monsoon flows. So you see a pocket in Southeast California, Northern California, even in Oregon. Now, in the center part of the country, there are large areas of wetter than normal from Texas northward, and a little bit in the Mid Atlantic region, though that region continues to shrink due to recent dry weather. Notably drier than normal in the northeast, so they've had some drought conditions up there. Now, for temperature, compared to the 30-year average, what are our temperatures so far? Well, they've been warmer than normal across the Great Basin and Southwest, and especially the Pacific Northwest. And you can see California, we were much cooler than normal. That's starting to erode due to our recent warm temperatures the past couple weeks. Now, there are still pockets in North Texas that have been cooler than normal, where it's also been wetter than normal. So, this is our conditions compared to a 30-year normal since about mid June. What weather pattern has created this? Well, I took a look at the weather pattern all the way back to May 1. So we really started to see a lack of moisture or lack of monsoon early in the summer. And we saw continuation of the dry winter early in the summer or late in the spring. So, in other words, the dry winter didn't all of a sudden change. That same weather pattern kept occurring. And that pattern is the upper level ridge over the Pacific Northwest, where they've had also a dry summer overall, but a big anomaly in the Western Pacific, an upper level ridge there as well. That's effectively caused the jet stream to push northward. Now, look in the middle of the country. We've had a kink in that jet stream, and this is several months of data, so not one storm, and you can see prevailing dip in the jet stream in the middle part of the country, where also was really wet for a good part of the summer. Now, also notice an upper ridge in the northeast where it's been mild but also very dry. Now in California, we've had an upper level low prevailing. So this isn't the winter pattern, this is the spring and summer pattern. And that upper low is not conducive to a prevailing monsoon condition. In fact, that should be an H over perhaps Utah or the Four Corners region to develop a consistent, persistent monsoon flow, and we just have not had that. So this weather pattern is concerning because it's a continuation of last winter and potential for it to continue as we go into fall and winter. In other words, warmer and drier than normal across much of the West. Now, that jet stream is very close to the Pacific Northwest, so that area could be wetter this fall along that black line if it does shift a little bit south. Okay, what are we expecting coming up? We are expecting neutral, which we currently have, to weak La Nina conditions. So what does that mean? It's the cool phase along the equatorial Pacific Ocean. Okay, it's the ocean conditions. It's not a storm. It's not a weather pattern. It's not rain or drought. But it's a condition in the tropical equatorial Pacific Ocean. Now, it does have some ability, because it's in the tropics, to either negatively affect the jet stream, meaning to allow the jet stream to get erratic and not organized, or in an El Nino situation, sometimes to allow it to become more organized or consolidated. So we're expecting neutral to weak La Nina this upcoming winter. If we compare that to some of the conditions we've seen in the past, well, colder conditions are typically expected with weak La Ninas in the west, including California, and warmer from the south to the east. Now, if you look at weak La Ninas since 2000, look how wet they've been in California. Yes, several of those have been record-breaking wet and record-breaking snow all the way back to 2010. And look at the dry signal in the Pacific Northwest. We see that typical dry signal in the southeast United States. Okay, now if we look at all La Ninas, okay, since the 1980s, and these are analogs, this is not a forecast, this is cheating, this is looking back at what already happened compared to a 30-year normal, we still see all La Ninas cooler in the west, especially the northwest, warmer in the south and the northeast. The dry signal since the 80s, very prevalent in the southeast, and the traditional wet signal in La Nina returns when you include the 1980s and 90s. Why is this significant? Well, we've seen a lot of trends recently, and a lot of what we saw and learned in the 80s and 90s is not necessarily applying now. Okay, if we look at La Nina since 2000, okay, La Nina, all of them since 2000, so that includes the weak, the moderate, the strong. Look how cold the northwest is and how warm the east is. So a very strong signal there. Now, when you're mixing all the La Nina cold phase together. Now, when you look at all the La Ninas, a couple things show up on precipitation. Very dry in Northern California and also dry in the Northwest. That's not consistent with traditional La Nina, right? Typically, La Ninas have been thought, like I just showed you, to be wet in the Northwest. The dry signal actually has expanded in the Southeast. So that signal is still there and becoming strong. All La Ninas for Southern California, well, it's a weak signal of dryness. Okay, what if we look at ENSO neutral and we look at all of those since 2000? Well, let's say we stay in a neutral condition in the equatorial Pacific Ocean, or it's mostly bouncing between weak La Nina and neutral. Very mild in California, very mild in the northeast and the southeast. We do see that colder than normal signal, which makes sense because with an amplified split jet stream or a big ridge in the east coast and a big ridge on the west coast, you tend to get a drop of cold air from Canada, or the jet stream's allowed to dive south. Now, when it comes to precipitation in the neutral, a very dry signal in California and really most of the West. So that's not encouraging since 2000 with the ENSO neutral. So if you look at precipitation in the rest of the country, you do see a wet signal in the Tennessee Valley and dry along the East Coast and deep south. So in other words, the wild card for this winter is weak La Nina, neutral conditions. That can throw at us a wide range of conditions with temperature, sort of, but especially with precipitation. So we've seen some very dry years and some very wet years with neutral and especially the weak La Nina. So something to watch as we go forward. Please check out our blogs and also our other YouTube videos if you want to see the latest outlook prediction for the upcoming winter. Okay, if you look at the ENSO neutral finally since the 1980s, so now we're going back to including the 80s and 90s, right, when we really thought we had a handle on ENSO, especially La Nina. Look how cold it has been in the past when you throw in the 80s and 90s. Most of the country cold in that type of neutral condition in the Pacific Ocean along the equator. Now, if you look at precipitation, still a dry signal on the west coast, so that has not gone away with ENSO neutral. And still dry in parts of the south, wet in the Tennessee Valley, and dry in the east coast. The big wild card when you have these neutral conditions is will or can we get significant atmospheric rivers or pineapple expresses. All you need is 2 or 3 of those in California, and that can make a big difference in your overall precipitation, even though it's only a couple storms. We saw that in 1955 and also 1964 in California. So neutral is quite difficult to forecast, like any winter is difficult to forecast, but even more so with recent trends indicating that the 80s and 90s, those conditions, especially with precipitation, aren't necessarily occurring now in recent decades. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed this outlook for warmer temperatures and return of tropical moisture late next week in mid-September. And then we also looked at some past years, not weather forecasts, but analogs. Again, if you want to look at the latest outlooks that we've put out, they're on YouTube and they're also posted on our blogs. You can also check real-time information on X and also other videos on YouTube and TikTok. Again, sign up for the blog if you want the latest information sent to you automatically. Thanks, everyone.